At the end of the 1980s, Japan was not just rich. It was the future, and everyone knew it. The land under Tokyo was worth more, on paper, than all the land in the United States of America. The gardens of the Imperial Palace alone were said to be worth more than the entire state of California. Japanese companies were buying Rockefeller Center, Hollywood studios, the world's most famous paintings. And then, on the very last trading day of 1989, it all quietly reached the top of the mountain, and began the longest fall in financial history. This is the story of the greatest asset bubble ever inflated, and the strangest crash ever recorded. No bank runs. No riots. No single black day of panic. Just a slow, silent, 34-year deflation of a national dream, which hollowed out a generation and invented the economic disease the whole world now fears catching. They call it Japanification. And it started with a miracle. Rising from the ashes of war, Japan built the most admired economy on earth. Toyota, Sony, Honda, Panasonic, Japanese cars and electronics conquered every market they entered. American executives read books with titles like Japan as Number One and lived in genuine fear of Tokyo. By the mid-1980s, Japan was the world's largest creditor, its banks were the biggest on the planet, and its rise seemed as unstoppable as the sunrise. Then, in September 1985, came the twist of fate that lit the fuse. At the Plaza Hotel in New York, the world's great economic powers pressured Japan into an agreement to weaken the US dollar. The yen nearly doubled in value in 2 years. Japanese exports, the engine of the miracle, suddenly cost twice as much abroad. Growth stalled. And Japan's central bank reached for the only lever it had, it slashed interest rates to the floor. Money became almost free, and it had to go somewhere. It went into land. It went into stocks. Japanese banks, flush with the world's largest deposits, shoveled loans at anyone with property to pledge, and property only ever went up, so every loan looked safe. Companies stopped making profits from products and started making them from speculation, they even had a word for it, Zaytech, financial engineering. The greatest bubble in human history was inflating, and it felt like genius. The frenzy reached every kitchen table. When the government listed its telephone monopoly NTT on the stock market in 1987, it became the largest share offering in history, and ordinary housewives queued to buy, certain it could only rise. Within months NTT alone was worth more than the entire stock markets of West Germany and Hong Kong combined. Taxi drivers gave stock tips. The market had stopped being finance. It was a national faith. The numbers from those years still sound like typing errors. A single square meter of land in Ginza sold for the price of a house in America. The grounds of the Imperial Palace were valued, on paper, above all the real estate in California. Golf club memberships traded like blue-chip stocks, some for more than $1 million, with their own price index. Banks offered 100-year mortgages, loans your grandchildren would still be paying. And Japan went shopping, for the world. Mitsubishi bought Rockefeller Center, the heart of Manhattan. Sony bought Columbia Pictures. A Japanese insurance tycoon paid a record $40 million for Van Gogh's sunflowers, almost as a gesture. American magazines wailed that Japan was buying America itself. On the Tokyo Exchange, the Nikkei index quadrupled in 5 years. Everyone was rich, forever. Underneath it all lay one article of faith the Japanese called the land myth, the belief that land prices in Japan could never fall. Not slow down, never fall, at all. And history seemed to prove it, they hadn't, not once, in the 4 decades since the war. Banks believed it, so they lent against land without limit. Regulators believed it, so they never tested it. When an entire financial system is built on a single sentence, only one thing has to break. On December 29, 1989, the final trading session of the decade, the Nikkei closed at 38,915. Champagne corks flew in Tokyo's brokerage houses. Analysts confidently predicted 50,000 within 2 years. No one rang a bell. No one panicked. It was just another record close. It would take 34 years, and an entire lost generation, before the Japanese stock market ever saw that number again. The pin was already in someone's hand. That same month, a new governor took over the Bank of Japan, this stone fortress in Nyanbashi. Yasushi Mino believed the bubble was rotting Japan's soul, pricing honest families out of homes forever. He raised interest rates. Then again. And again, 5 times in barely a year. And in 1990, regulators simply ordered the banks to stop growing their property loans. The free money era ended almost overnight. The stock market understood first. Through 1990, the Nikkei fell almost 40%, one of the worst annual collapses any major market has ever suffered. Yet the strange thing was the quiet. Number 1929 style suicides on Wall Street, no crowds outside banks. Japanese institutions all held each other's shares, and no one wanted to be seen selling. The bubble did not pop so much as begin, very slowly, to exhale. Land was even slower, and far crueler. Property prices did not crash, they bled, a few percent every year, for 15 straight years. Commercial land in the great cities eventually lost as much as 80% of its value. Every year, owners told themselves the bottom was in. Every year, it wasn't. The collateral under the entire Japanese banking system, all those safe property loans, was dissolving in slow motion. And here is where Japan made its fateful choice, the one economists still argue about. The banks did not admit their losses. With regulators looking away, they quietly rolled over loans to bankrupt companies, lending dead borrowers just enough to pay interest on the old debt. The problem was not solved, it was hidden, inside the vaults, inside the accounts, inside a culture where no one wanted to be the first to say the miracle was over. They were called zombie companies, firms that earned too little to ever repay their debts, kept walking by banks too fragile to bury them. Zombie firms clogged every industry, blocking new companies, freezing wages, devouring credit. Japan's economy did not collapse, it congealed. Growth fell to 1%, then below. And a strange new disease appeared, one the modern world had never seen in a rich country. Prices began to fall. Deflation had arrived. Deflation sounds pleasant, everything gets cheaper. It is a trap. If prices will be lower next year, why buy today? If your debts stay fixed while your income shrinks, you drown in slow motion. Households stopped spending. Companies stopped investing. The Bank of Japan cut rates toward zero and found that even free money could not make a frightened nation borrow. The economy had entered a maze that economists barely had maps for. The first bodies to surface were the Jusen, housing loan companies that had gorged on property lending at the very top. By the mid-90s they were dead beyond rescue, and in 1996 the government did the unthinkable, it used taxpayers' money to bury them. The public was furious, the first open admission that the Bubbles bill would land on ordinary citizens. It would not be the last. For 7 years, the system held its breath. Then, in November 1997, the same month the Asian crisis was raging across the region, the dam finally broke at home. In a single month, a major securities house failed, then Hokkaido Takashoku became the first big commercial bank to collapse in post-war Japan, and then came the unthinkable, Yamaichi Securities, 100 years old, one of the legendary Big Four brokerages, gone, buried under hidden losses it had smuggled off its books for years. The image Japan never forgot came at Yamaichi's final press conference. Its president, Shoei Nozawa, broke down live on national television, sobbing, bowing, begging, "The employees are not to blame, please, give them work." For a culture built on composure, that weeping executive was the moment the mask fell. The miracle was over, and now everyone had seen it cry. The following year, one of the giants, the Long-Term Credit Bank of Japan, once a pillar of the entire industrial system, was nationalized in the largest bank failure the world had then seen. Taxpayers swallowed the losses. And Japan, at last, began the brutal accounting it had postponed for a decade, trillions of yen of bad loans, dragged into the light, one write-off at a time. The government, meanwhile, tried to pave its way out of the trap. Stimulus after stimulus poured concrete across the country, highways to empty peninsulas, bridges to islands with a few hundred residents, dams and airports no one needed. It kept the construction industry breathing, and it buried the state in debt. Japan's government liabilities swelled past 200% of its economy, the heaviest burden of any rich nation on earth. The bubble's debts had not vanished. They had simply moved house, onto the public books. The bill was paid by a generation. Young people who left school in the late 90s walked into what Japan calls the employment ice age. The lifetime jobs their fathers took for granted simply did not exist. Millions drifted into temporary work, freeders, or gave up entirely. Marriages were postponed. Birth rates sank. An entire cohort's life plans quietly dissolved into the deflation. The darkest number arrived in 1998, the year after the bank failures. Suicides in Japan jumped by a third, past 30,000 a year, disproportionately middle-aged men, the loyal salarymen of the miracle, ashamed of restructuring lists and debts they could not repay. The bubble had been an abstraction of land prices and stock indexes. Its collapse was fathers, in quiet rooms, who could not tell their families the company had let them go. Cornered, the Bank of Japan began inventing the future. In 1999 it cut interest rates to exactly zero, the first major central bank in modern history to do so. When that wasn't enough, in 2001 it created something entirely new, printing money to buy bonds directly, an experiment it named quantitative easing. The world's economists watched with detached fascination, certain this was a uniquely Japanese oddity. In 2008, every one of them would be running Japan's playbook. The bottom, when it finally came, was almost unbelievable. In March 2009, the Nikkei touched 7,054, down 82% from that champagne evening in 1989, 20 years before. Land in some cities had fallen even further. An entire generation had worked its whole career inside a single, endless bear market. And still Japan functioned, clean, safe, polite, and quietly, permanently poorer than it had promised its children it would be. The full circle took 34 years. On February 22, 2024, the Nikkei finally closed above its 1989 peak. The salaryman who bought stocks at the top as a 30-year-old was 65 before he broke even, if he had lived, and if he had held. No other major economy in modern history has ever waited that long. That is what makes Japan's crash unique, not its violence, but its patience. And the fear Japan gave the world now has a name: Japanification. Every time a Western economy stalls, every time Europe flirts with deflation, every time China's property market cracks under its own mountain of debt, the same anxious question is asked in central banks everywhere: are we turning Japanese? Because Japan proved that a modern economy doesn't have to explode. It can simply stop. And stay stopped for a generation. The lesson of Japan is the quietest and maybe the most important in this entire series. Bearings died in a weekend. LTCM in weeks. Argentina in a December. Japan's bubble took 34 years to repay, because instead of taking the pain, everyone agreed, politely, to pretend. The banks pretended their loans were good. The state pretended the banks were fine. The bill did not disappear. It just compounded, in the dark, charged to the young. And yet, be fair to Japan, it chose its poison with its eyes open. By spreading the pain across decades, it avoided what a fast crash might have brought: mass unemployment, evictions, the social wreckage America saw in 1929 or 2008. The streets stayed safe, the trains ran on time, no one starved. Japan bought social peace, and paid for it with time. Whether that trade was wisdom or cowardice is a question its own economists still cannot answer. So here is the question I'll leave you with. When the bubble bursts, which is worse, the crash that destroys you in a week, like Argentina, or the slow deflation that steals 34 years, like Japan? And the harder one, look at your own country's markets today, at the prices everyone insists are normal, and ask what a Tokyo analyst would have said about Ginza in 1989. Tell me in the comments. And subscribe, because on this channel, the ledger always comes due.